Is Zumba still something that people do? Remember
Oh, good.
Zumba?
I forgot about that.
I got to go to my Zumba class.
Well, every few years there's some kind of exercise trend that takes the world by storm, and I think it must be these like gyms that have to like kind of like rotate into the next trend to stay in business, right? I would assume so.
Well, speaking about strange exercises, first of all, this is the Lydia and Spin with Lydia Lunch and Tim Dahl, episode number 238. Have you heard about this? And I've never been on TikTok, so I only get my news secondhand. This latest trend called jenging. Well, it's not something you would need, Tim, but I hear it's very popular amongst, I don't know, fools, where it's an attempt to enlarge the penis by stretching on it, which breaks the tissue in it, but it could also cause it to grow or shrink. It just seems like an extreme form of masturbation, which I'm all for extreme forms of masturbation, but this is the latest trend. I just thought I'd warn you.
Is there any scientific proof backing this up that it can work?
Absolutely not.
Yeah, that seems like a very bad choice.
I mean, all I know is that if I'm engaged in extreme masturbation, yeah, it does occasionally happen. Something gets a little larger, but it's certainly not my penis.
And so people hang themselves?
No, they just pull on it. I mean, I don't know what the difference is between just pulling.
There you go.
Well, look, I hope that when I'm pulling on somebody that it is getting bigger, but I usually don't mean to rip the tissues unless, of course, I'm trying to crack a dick. And then
well, that's the point. I was saying, like, they used to sell these things in the 90s. They still might sell them in guitar shops called Grip Master. So when you're in your car and you can just kind of squeeze this hand thing with your fingers.
Hand, right.
It's like, well, why don't you just practice? And then you're learning the music and you're strengthening your fingers. It makes no sense.
Well, there are penis pumps, but the thing is, again, men. Look, I'm not saying there aren't size queens, but most men are more concerned with the size of their Vienna sausage than women, because if you do a good job, it doesn't matter what you're doing it with. And then, by the way, that's why they make sex toys. But speaking about somebody that could have used a frickin' sex toy, why is it always Florida? Female passenger, 60 years old, stripped naked on a Frontier Airlines from Orlando to Philadelphia. And now she's, of course, slapped with federal charges. And her interesting name, she sounds almost like a horchata. Her name is Dolce Horthus. Been charged with interference with flight crew members, simple assault, and indecent. And to think she's stripped naked from the waist down.
Oh, that's always funny.
Squatted in the aisle. Not really any. She had 2 cocktails, all right. Come on. You know how many cocktails it takes me to pull my pants down? Depends on the night, I guess.
Right, I guess so.
Anyway, the passengers were shocked and disgusted. They were screaming. She said, "I don't give a fuck. Fuck you. I gotta go pee." Of course, nobody enjoyed this spectacle. I don't understand. This is such a modern phenomena. This bad behavior on flights. It's horrifying.
Yeah, that really did explode. No pun intended. During the pandemic and all the mask mandates, or all the stuff that was going on the airplane, and then people started saying "my freedoms" or something, and they started acting insane. But there's other elements too. I mean,
she went one step further and not only pulled her pants down, but supposedly exposed her anus, which is, she
was that a threat? Was that a threat? Exactly. So I mean, I guess another factor, and this I'm being kind of serious now. We both fly enough. The flight experience, or as Rat Bastard calls it, the new bus. The flying is like the Greyhound of the 70s now. Rich people fly privately. The experience sucks so much, and people are stressed out, and I kind of see why people are acting up. To be honest, I mean, they squeeze you for everything. They want your experience to be miserable unless you shell out more money, and it's frustrating after a while. Yeah.
Well, again, this is, I don't know if you've heard about it. I find this very, very fascinating. What's going on in France right now? I mean, this is kind of well-aimed protest as opposed to just one, stray drunk or maniacal or stressed out person taking it out on the whole flight that has nothing to do with their problems. But farmers in France now are causing, France and Spain very big on protest, as we know.
Oh, yes.
But the farmers are protesting because they're being, underpriced by foreign stock. So they've decided to form a blockade. But not only that, they've burning tires, burning food, but better yet, on local government buildings, spraying manure. Now, since we know that most governments are full of shit, it seems to make sense to me that they're actually spraying, and I mean huge hoses of manure on government buildings. Hey, give them what they're made of, I guess.
Well, we've talked about this in France is quick to go to the streets historically. I kind of wish they blew up the billionaires' houses. I mean, I've been in situations where I'm on tour and then suddenly I'm late to the gig because the whole fucking system shuts down. Or we had that system. We had that situation where we had to cancel the London show because we couldn't take the Channel or the ferry because it was all being blocked
well, that's
up.
why I say manure on government buildings is a good idea, but let the rest of us get by. Now, speaking of, I mean, I don't know why this is such a pro-poo podcast today.
I like the alliteration.
Well, last Friday, pro-Palestinian rally at Columbia University, the people were there and they were sprayed with a foul substance called the skunk.
Oh, no.
The skunk. 18 students reported a putrid smell not only during and while they were sprayed, but afterwards. Some had to seek medical attention.
Sure.
But this is the latest Crime Stopper. I mean, people say I washed my hair 9 times. I still stunk. It was the worst smell I've ever had. And it's by a chemical company called Odor Tech, a private Israeli company. Okay. The skunk mist, which is fired from a water cannon, is usually yellow and leaves a stench of sewage in the mouth, hair, and clothes of the sprayed people. A stench difficult to remove. And now, supposedly, of course, they're trying to sell it to law enforcement agencies worldwide, especially, of course, the American local police departments. I mean, look, I thought there was a right to protest. So this is what it smells like: rotting meat, old socks that haven't been washed, with, open sewer. And then you're covered with this stuff and not being able to. Another reporter said, imagine taking a chunk of rotting corpse from a stagnant sewer, placing it in a blender, and spraying the filthy liquid in your face.
Yeah, but Vince McMahon doesn't have a job right now. Why not just hire him? Why buy it?
Well, Vince McMahon at least had the decency to poop on one head at a time. Speaking about the dark side of the ring around your ass.
I know that's gonna be an interesting one.
Simon, what would you say, Simon?
I said this might be a good business opportunity for him. I'm just saying, he's out of wrestling. This seems to fit.
Yeah, well,
fit his interest.
We'll see what happens with that one. I'm very curious.
Well, I mean, right at this moment, and here's where I wouldn't mind dumping a load of poop on. About 40 of the members of the 118th Congress have violated federal insider trading conflicts. Come on. We know this, involving failures to properly disclose stock trades. Yeah, come on. Why do you think they're all fucking rich? And why do you think they don't give a shit about what happens to us? Of course, 40 out of 118.
Well,
I think it's an underestimate.
When the rules and the punishment is less than the potential gains, of course, people are going to take that risk. I mean, it's, I got caught. It's a little slap on the wrist.
Well, I'll quote Desaad here for a moment, who said, the threat of the guillotine has not stopped any crimes. The threat of death penalty doesn't stop crimes. You're either a natural born criminal, you become one, or you try to keep your nose clean. That means staying away from Vince McMahon and the protests that are happening right now.
One thing you want to stay away from are destroying angels. You know what those are?
I don't.
They are a type of mushroom. And Bill Hickman from Ohio claims his family's been foraging for mushrooms for years. He's been doing it. He went out there and he claims he had this app just to be safe. You take a photograph and it tells you if you can eat it. He picked the things, sauteed them up. He said they were delicious. And then sure enough,
died.
He didn't. His wife was there. Was like, this doesn't make sense. He was just, in fetal position on the floor of the bathroom. And I mean, he came close to dying. Extremely toxic. But I guess they're delicious. I mean, he said he enjoyed eating them.
Like blowfish, I guess. I mean, let's face it. Mushrooms, they're real aliens. They can kiss or kill you. That's how they are.
Absolutely. So Jolene Waldorf, sorry, excuse me. In northern Wisconsin, we have that little cold spell that was really brutal the other week.
Yep.
It was -2 Fahrenheit, -20 wind chill. Her car didn't start in the morning because it was just so frozen. She's like, oh, I guess I have to take the bus to work. Slips on the ice at the bus stop, hits her head on the fence, and is knocked out, and then freezes to death because it's so cold. But there's videos of people just walking over her.
Might be a bomb. Might be a bomb. Which, by the way,
pretty much.
Bomb. Nobody is there are some people that are bombs, but I mean, no, you don't walk over a person frozen. Well, what about those 3 guys that froze to death in their backyard of their sports?
That's mysterious.
What the hell's going on?
Well, they think maybe it was fentanyl. It was like a NFL Sunday wolf and chips and dogs kind of day with the boys, and I think they got a little tipsy and like, hey, let's call our guy. And then next thing you know, I think they probably went out to get a smoke, and all of them died sitting in the chairs just right outside the door.
The thing is, look, you don't freeze to death in 5 minutes unless I guess you're
no. I think they were
Siberia.
They're going to find out, but
how long do you think it takes to? I mean, say you're not knocked unconscious. How long do you think it takes to freeze to death, Tim? Hypothermia. Well, I mean, I know if you're in cold water, it can take. It's not that slow. It's not that quick.
Well,
it's pretty quick.
I know it's probably relative to how cold it is, and I think Jolene's case, they claim because there's video. She fell and she was on the ground for 20 minutes and she went into hypothermia. I mean, it was -2 Fahrenheit. And she was like, her head was on a block of ice. So I mean, she was just like, they had to get help. She needed help. There was one woman that had the sense like, maybe this person needs help, and called the ambulance. It was too late at that point. Well,
I don't know what to say. Well, I certainly don't fear freezing to death because I'm a minor volcano. But
what's the George Carlin line that the middle class do the work, the rich own everything, the middle class do the work, the poor are there to scare the middle class into getting back to work. So I mean, just going back to the whole point is like a homeless person, that's trying to help. That is more terrifying to most people than potentially, I don't know. I mean, really poor people scare people.
Well, look, what's interesting at this point is more people would rather, I haven't taken a survey of the millions of numbers, but there's so many millions of idiots wanting to believe an orange ass clown's endless lies and psychopathology than would take a moment of empathy to realize, hey, asshole, you know what? Vote again for him, and you could be the next one in line to be on the streets unhoused. Because most people in America, I would say at least a third, probably half, could be one check away from ending up unhoused.
Well, there's that.
So have a little empathy. And there's no one reason why people, I mean, at one point, I'm talking about 20 years ago, at one point, the highest number of unhoused people were in Texas, and they were Vietnam vets. There's any number of reasons people, and look, some people are crazy, but as if living unhoused on the street wouldn't make you that way. There's just no social net here. Have you been to another country, that isn't a third world country, have you ever in Europe seen flocks of homeless people? No, because there is usual human dignity and care.
Brazil, you can see that shit. In the Americas, you see that shit.
Talking about Europe for the moment.
Yeah. Not in Europe. It's strangely enough you see it in Japan, but that's a whole other thing.
In Japan, they just lock themselves in the house and never come out.
Well, there's that too. I mean, speaking of Texas, that
home full.
Garland came out with a final report about that school shooting in Texas, where basically all the cops and the Texas Rangers were like, yeah, we're tough guys. And they always would say, like, the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun's a good guy with a gun. Well, in this case, they were fucking chicken shit, and they surrounded while this guy just picked people off left and right for like 45 minutes, an hour, knowing this guy was in there. And of course, the DA is not going to do anything to help the family. They're helping the police force. So basically, your tax money is going to militarize these police, who are actually in reality fucking a bunch of wimps. And it's not like Walker, Texas Ranger. They're actually terrified.
Well, and look, a point is this: if you've got, say, a Taurus or a Smith and Wesson, or just a gun with 6 bullets, and you're up against somebody that's got an AR or whatever, I can understand that there's a bit of freaking fear involved. And the problem is, why are young men, why are they allowed to get these into their fucking hands? Because there is no reason to have that kind of weapon unless you're in a war zone. And war, for the most part, is in their own heads. And they take it out on people that have, for the most part, nothing to do with what their pain or trauma is. And that's the sad reality.
Yeah, that's a sad reality, and it is the reality. So I'm going to use this as a segue into a new section, a new thing called Ask the Lydian Spin. We had a listener direct a question towards us, and maybe you can answer it. The question is,
well, maybe you can, because since you're bringing it up, go ahead, throw it
out.
Maybe
again. Do you think there is much connection between no wave and jazz, according to David Rogers? I think I know the answer to that, but
jazz. I mean, the thing is, no wave is a very specific term. Jazz is a non-specific term because there's many types of jazz. There's easy listening, there's alt, there's out. So if the question was a bit more specific, like, do you think no wave has, more connection to a really outrageous jazz? Well, of course, but it also has connection to Dada. It also has a connection to just the rebellious nature of people that, want to do something that sounds like nothing else, which is what really good out jazz also is.
But I was saying this, like, no wave is like a philosophy because none of the bands really sound like each other. What is jazz? That's, as you're saying, that's a debate to this day. But
and again, it's a generic term. I think that no wave is a very specific term that has a more enclosed concept than most other terms of music.
Well, but definitely, just like no wave will
philosophy.
Well, philosophy, borrow from any kind of idea that it feels like it wants to borrow from. So jazz sometimes does fall into that.
I'm just going to talk about my own initial no wave project, Teenage Jesus. We had more in tune with a factory that would chop up human bones and make chemical patties out of them. More of like a car factory exploding and blowing bullets out in extreme rhythm at one time, followed by something slicing and dicing. So I'm not sure about that.
Fine.
Sure. Well, sure it does.
So if anyone wants to ask a question in the future, info
Send it to Tim, not to me.
Well, no, info at lydianspin.net. We'll consider it.
Absolutely.
And thanks, David, for being bold enough to even ask us such a question.
Not a problem. Ask, and you might get an answer, and you might just get a diversionary tactic.
There's that too.
I want to just call up Mars as an example that has a relation to nothing except for, you might say interstellar, or in my case, I'd say extrastellar space. That would be what lies between one ear and the other when you're absolutely psychotically insane. So beyond Coltrane, just insane in the membrane, which is why probably it's my favorite no wave band. That would be Mars.
And who's our guest this week?
Well, one of my favorite people forever on the planet, the most perpetual teenager of all, the poet, the composer, the guitar player, the vocalist, the author of Sonic Life out now, Thurston Moore. This is the Lydian Spin with Lydia Lunch, Tim Dahl, episode number 238. Thurston Moore coming at you and reading from his new book. Yes. This is the Lydian Spin with Lydia Lunch, Tim Dahl, and Thurston Moore, who is a composer, poet, guitarist, vocalist, I'd say my very favorite, endless, unjaded teenager, and probably one of the only people I ever miss not being physically near on the planet.
Oh,
Keystone, hello.
Hi.
How are you doing? Where are you?
Doing? It's been a while. It's been a minute. Last time we talked was about 2 years ago.
2 minutes in the space of things.
Are you in Miami right now?
I'm at no fixed address.
Okay, that's fine. That works for me. That works for me.
That we all love. We're nomads. Let's face it. Thurston Moore, I'm so excited to have you as a repeat attender on this podcast to celebrate your amazing. How the hell did you remember so much? Your amazing new book, Sonic Life. Not only is it fatty, It's jam packed with. Were you always taking journals? How do you remember all this shit?
I didn't take journals. I wish I kept a diary. I mean, my God, I my memory is okay, but I sort of
excuse me, your memory is astonishing.
Well, I did a lot of research. I went to,
Okay.
a lot of my memory was sort of spurred on by looking at like gigographies and discographies. Because you're living these years and you're working, as you know. When we release records, we do shows. People out there have actually kept records of shows and so I went to the library during the pandemic. I realized that I really needed to reference the Village Voice, especially for like 70s, early 80s, of all the activity.
Always despised me, by the way. Whatever.
Well, I wasn't really interested in any sort of critical capacity of the Village Voice. I was interested in just their listings. That was kind of like, one of the primary sort of aspects of the Village Voice that made it so legendary was that it listed everything from like poetry readings to like little back room film events, etc. And so I attempted to sort of like acquire like all the copies of the Village Voice, which was impossible because they go online for like $50 a pop. And so, it would be hundreds of thousands of dollars just to acquire the Village Voice coming out.
Just to stimulate your own memory.
Well, there was no digital online of it. There was one Google Doc site, but it becomes blacked out in the 80s. And so, it was useless to me. So I started calling different like ephemera and book collectors and saying, can you get me these? And they were like, well, no, you should try calling the New York Public Library. I said, well, the libraries are closed. It's a pandemic.
It's a pandemic.
But I finally got a hold of somebody there, and they said it's a crime that the New York Public Library does not have digital on the Village Voice. And I said, that is a crime. He said, well, somebody may. And so I just kept looking and looking. I finally went to the Library of Congress site, which is a warren of information. It's like there's so much information there. It took me a few days until I finally found
the listings you were looking for.
Found one library that had microfilm of the Village Voice from 1958 to 19.
Where was that library?
Well, it was in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. As it was.
Like, why?
How convenient.
Yeah, it was. I was ready to fly anywhere and like just set up camp and like better than
$50 a pop to just look at who was playing where when.
I just happened to be in South Miami. I rented a car. I called the place up. I said, "Do you have this?" It took a while for some elderly woman to say, "Supposedly we do." And I gambled. I drove over there. This is like right when libraries were just beginning to open. Everybody's still masked. Everybody's like very wary of what's
including
going on.
Florida. I thought Florida was kind of open.
Well,
early.
Those who actually sort of like subscribe to reality, yes. And so I drove into Fort Lauderdale. The building was a monolith, surrounded by homeless encampments, and there was nobody inside. It was like it's an 8-story, huge, block long building. Walked in, went up to the periodicals department on the 5th floor. It was all plastic partitions, so nobody could breathe on each other. And they rolled out a cart with like a tottering with microfilm. Like little microfilm boxes, and they showed me how to run the analog machine. And I spent like a couple of weeks from like 10 in the morning to 10 at night, just going through the Village Voice and being able to sort of put on a thumb drive what I needed. And
let me say this: your book is so chock-a-block with details about. It is one of the most accurate portrayals of New York from the late 70s, mid 80s and on, because thank you, microfilm. Thank you, one building in Fort Lauderdale existing, because look, we were at a lot of these things. Don't trust my memory, because you know what you felt like being there. You remember that. We remember what it felt like to be in those places.
Well, that was the thing. I did want to talk about. I did want to place you there. I a lot of books I read about, especially through music memoirs, read about that take place in New York City, which, of course, we're very intimate with. And so I always felt very frustrated reading a lot of music memoirs that sort of take place in that particular city, and where I feel like it takes for granted that the reader knows exactly what was going on there. So I wanted to really sort of place the reader there as much as possible. The book was 800 pages. I whittled it down to 5.
And so now it's like 500.
Yeah. So, and there was a lot more there's a whole chapter on sort of like, my favorite knish.
By the way, when was the last time you had a knish? And I had to say, I had a knish about 5 years ago with Shani Ray, and we're, of course, from Katz's Deli. Still couldn't finish a whole knish, and it was delish. The knish was delish.
Yeah, stuff it with mustard. My God.
I mean, we lived on that shit.
But Yona Kimmel was the knish place. That was sort of also on Houston Street, and so I wrote a lot about the knishes and the hot dogs.
The knish chapter is like that's the
pickle
extras.
Barrel, the pickle barrel. If
it was a DVD, it would be the behind the scenes or the extra.
So there's a lot of food. Somebody actually wrote to me and said, like, you tend to write a lot about food in your book. Now, I don't really consider myself a foodie per se, but in some ways it defined a lot of our survival. It was like what you could afford to eat.
They don't realize how hungry we were.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, and what we had to live on, which was knishes, pizzas, bagels, dine and dash, stealing from the supermarket on First Avenue was a good gig of mine. Yeah.
So how'd you find the sweet spot between not mansplaining and then of course not assuming people knew all these perspectives and situations in New York?
Well, I certainly wanted to talk more about like the secondary and tertiary sort of artists that were very primary to us, and so because I know that they very rarely get the ink, and so I really wanted to sort of explain like something like Boris Police Band, in a book that's being published by like, a mainstream publishing house.
And let me just interject for 1 second, because, the great book that you did on No Way with Byron Coley, which is really fantastic about that period. Your book, Sonic Life, really branches out, which encompasses No Way, but it encompasses what came beyond it. And it does encompass a lot of the art scene, which was very important to what was going on at the time. Yeah. And I think that's what's really important about this book, is it's so much more well-rounded than books that are more specific to a certain genre or a certain music or even a certain time frame. So that's what I found very interesting. And also because I wasn't really part of the art scene. You're the arty one.
Yeah, but
the anti-art one.
But artists adored you, and that was you to them were like such an inspiration to their own sort of like their own interest in sort of like aesthetics that come from the margins or edgy or something that was real.
Now, I've really recognized their gratitude. Thank you.
You had this experience as a really sort of this real personal perspective of like what it was like to be alive and living in New York, and like whatever your experiences were, everybody gleaned that from you, and sort of like they took that energy, and so I think that's what made it so interdisciplinary, that everybody regarded each other regardless of what their disciplines were. You could be a painter, be a filmmaker, be a musician. It didn't really matter, as long as you were sort of doing something and you were being expressive.
Thurston, as you just say that, what makes me kind of think of is, people came to New York at that period from many different places, and a lot of like Mars, they came from St. Petersburg, although they might be from Cleveland or wherever. People were in St. Petersburg, they were in different places, they were in Cleveland. They came from various places. And even though a lot of people were poor, whether they were poor, middle class or not, I guess because I came from a riot zone, and a few others did too, like Adele Bertay, that made me prepared, or already more New York than New York. That is still very New York about me, because I came from such a rough and tumble experience from a very early age. So,
which actually leads me to a question, Thurston. Your experience when you first started playing the guitar, which was, I believe, was in Connecticut and Bethel, and I reading part of your the beginning of your book, when you went to some like group lesson and it was some hippie thing, and you're like, I'm not into this. you were living next to Danbury, where that's where Charles Ives is from, and whenever you drive through that area, there's all these there's I wouldn't say shrines, but there's I think there's a museum, there's definitely an auditorium. Was that there used to be music, basic music education in public education. It doesn't really exist anymore. But was Charles Ives talked about when you were growing up? Because, well, if you live in any town where, if you live where Mark Twain lived, you would read about that. Like any town where someone who's kind of a hero, they talk about the local hero.
Charles Ives was definitely a name that I would hear very early on. My father was teaching at Western Connecticut State College, which has the Charles Ives Hall, etc. My father was very involved with music professorship, and so Charles Ives was again a name I knew, but I wasn't really aware of him being sort of so significant in 20th century American music. I mean, his idiom was sort of taking sort of folk tropes of American music and putting them in a classical context.
But also experimental and maybe a precursor to modernism and serialism in some ways. So it's he was already there with that, and he was a very much an American, so that he kind of gave a bit of to regard sort of the USA to have the same kind of status as Europe when it comes to sort of classical music. That really doesn't start happening until you have people like Ives coming in and doing that.
I know that we're both very influenced by American, especially Southern Gothic writers, but also we're very affected by British music, especially, punk, post-punk, and that. But I'm just wondering, as somebody that went to Europe with Teenage Jesus, because I knew I had to go there if I wanted to have any kind of a quote-unquote career, did you feel, even at that time, you just said that Charles Ives, it was very American. Did you have a more European concept of where you would eventually have to go?
I thought all of that was happening in New York City. And I thought, and I think I was correct in thinking that New York City was was a gathering place of all of these different aspects that came out of the European, diaspora. It was all there. It was all, and it was the most international city in the world, and it kind of continues to be in some degree. But before we were able to all sort of share everything online, I mean, you had to go to the cities. You mentioned Mars coming out of St. Petersburg and people coming out of Cleveland. It's they probably didn't have to leave St. Petersburg or Cleveland if they had access to the internet that we have now. So that, that changes technology just changes everything.
Also, one of my theories is that creation is like a virus. And if you want to just look at it in the 1900 to 2000, is there were different cities at different times that were the magnet to these moths like us that came to a place because of economics and because of the art that was going on there, like Paris in the 20s, Weimar, Berlin in the 30s, Chicago in the 40s, Memphis maybe in the 50s, 60s, Haight-Ashbury, 70s, New York, London, Los Angeles. And, and then with the internet is when things didn't have to be, unfortunately, so focused in a certain state. And also things got more expensive. It was harder to move. It was harder to live places.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it was just going where the action is. And if the action is on the internet, it's just well, God bless you. I mean, I don't know.
Part of the struggle, besides a saturation and a surplus of so much information and media, that there is not a little pep rally gathering, which basically can maybe feed a consensus on something, where basically there is no consensus on anything anymore, where if people could kind of gather the troops in a location, it's just a theory I'm shooting from.
Well, also now what I find very disheartening are massive festivals claiming or semi-alt, which have closed a lot of clubs in places like Barcelona, when you're just going to have, the massive festivals in the summer that people are going to pay $300 a ticket to go and see 20, 30, 40 bands that can't anymore come to clubs because they don't exist in some towns anymore. I think that's really horrifying as well. I prefer the intimacy, and I'm sure for the most part, so do you, because you played huge festivals. But then with the Thurston Moore Band, you continue to play clubs because we like an intimate exchange. I'm talking for you with our peeps.
That's very true. I mean, I've always, yeah, I've always enjoyed the more intimate space for sure, but,
There's never a space intimate enough for me and you, but that's why, even thousands of miles away, I still love you. So would you mind blessing me with a reading of your new book, Sonic Life?
let's see what I can do here.
Okay, pull something out.
There's a chapter called Another Planet. CBGB in the summer of 1977 continued to place rickety wooden chairs and tables in front of the stage. But as gigs by a few of the more popular bands began to attract significantly larger crowds, these ancient furnishings would become ridiculous obstacles that took up too much real estate. Driving in to see Patti Smith play there in mid-July, this is about, I think, 77, I think. My friend Harold is with me, who I write quite a bit about in this book. Harold and I knew enough to get to the club by late afternoon and situate ourselves in line outside the club's saloon doors, as the queue would progressively snake down Bowery and around to First Street. Homeless winos, their clothes and beards smeared with city grime, would beg for loose coin or, in states of inebriated lunacy, serenade the people in line with loud, caterwauling Bowery barroom songs, from Gene Kelly, Take Me Out to the Bar, yeah, to Frank Sinatra, Strangers in the Night. At times, they would be swishing a bottle of rot gut wine in one hand and raising a huge roasted turkey leg in the other. These culinary quirks, affordable even on a vagrant's budget, could be procured from the deli across the street. We would pop into the place ourselves for cigarettes and at times a turkey leg. They were hearty, all the better drenched in watered down hot sauce, slipping our cash through a hole at the bottom of a hard plastic divider, yellowed with age, separating the cashier and register from anyone thinking of sticking up the place, something that had surely happened too many times before. The night of Patti's show, we were able to score a couple of seats near the stage as people plowed in, our bodies and chairs rammed into each other, the waitresses yelling at us through the tumult to order something given the 2-drink minimum. Just when we thought it couldn't get any more crowded, the waitstaff began pushing their way through the throng, shouting, "Move, move, move!" It was like Moses parting the Red Sea. They picked one of the tables up into the air and slammed it down right next to where Harold and I sat, cowering, then banged a candle in a fat red jar onto the empty table. Then, through the violent wake, came William Burroughs and his assistant, James Grauerholtz, special guests of their friend Patti. Harold and I looked at each other in amazement. We were all but elbow to elbow with Burroughs, the beat legend, who was dressed in a dapper suit and tie, glancing at us with steely, seen-it-all eyes. Grauerholtz reached over to light the bard's cigarette. Patti later took the stage, all burners on high, wearing black leather trousers and a white t-shirt. Everyone immediately stood up, including us, though not Burroughs and Grauerholtz. She sauntered like a panther, ready to rip the place apart, knowing her beat mentor was in attendance. I bit the bottom of my lip, staring at this feral vision within arm's reach, and she quickly caught my eye, the tallest boy in the room, and bit her lip back at me, then grasped the microphone to split the night wide open. As the steamy July got underway, the Sex Pistols' third triumph, Pretty Vacant, was released, easily out-motoring the competition, a killer rampage of a record, the group at the peak of its power. With this single and the Ramones' Sheena is a Punk Rocker becoming the broiling soundtracks for our punk rock ecstasy, we could hardly imagine anything more seismic. But on the 13th of July, in the demolition zone that was New York City, all manner of hell would be unleashed. The day had begun with intense heat and humidity. Harold and I headed into the city from Bethel to hang out at CBGB, as had become our custom. A record-breaking heat wave had instated itself that morning, and by early evening, low-slung lightning bolts began to aggressively zap across the sky. As we drove south on Broadway from 14th Street, we noticed the lights in some buildings randomly switching off. Turning east onto Bleecker Street, we heard the clacking of streetlights and could see electricity shutting down in patterns on either side of us. By the time we parked and walked over to the club, the entire area was utterly blacked out. Hilly stood outside CBGB holding a candle. We hung out on the street with him, waiting and wondering if the power would return anytime soon. Within an hour, the feeling that chaos was about to erupt was palpable. Police and fire truck sirens became more and more constant. Distant shouts and screams echoed through the streets, punctuated by sounds of breaking glass. Car and store alarms offered a discordant soundtrack to the pitch blackness of the city, usually lit up at all hours of the day. Hilly decided to lock up the club. It seemed obvious the power wasn't about to return. With the streetlights out and the yellow taxis slaloming between speeding cop cars and fire engines more recklessly than usual, it was nearly impossible to navigate the Beetle through the grid of the city. The Beetle is our Volkswagen car that we would drive back and forth. Vagrants had begun to build bonfires and trash cans in the middle of the avenues, taking it upon themselves to direct traffic. Anarchy reigned. The blackout caused by lightning strikes upon a power grid already on its knees broke down the walls of economic privilege. A disenfranchised and demoralized citizenry began raiding stores for food, clothing, televisions, stereo equipment, anything historically denied people by the systemic poverty that pressed upon their daily lives. While there were those who looted for sheer kicks, most were spurred on by destitution, anger, and desperation. By the time Harold and I made it to the West Side Highway, we could see fires licking buildings where Upper Manhattan merged into Harlem and then the South Bronx. Helicopters buzzed overhead, aiming high-powered light beams into the detonated blocks. We retreated to the safety of Connecticut. A week after the blackout, with electricity fitfully returning, disco and all its permutations, its music, dancing, and style, would return undimmed. Through the summer of 1977, it would ramp up in intensity, the music industry's new gold mine. The much discussed rift between punk and disco was real, and to a horde of puerile punk boys, disco was nothing more than a vapid, escapist rush, a scene that favored double-knit slacks, silk shirts, and layer-cut hairdos, anathema at the venues I frequented. Disco would prove itself in time to be an organic and innovative music, evoking a wholly modern collaborative joy for black and white, gay and straight, rich and poor listeners alike, later informing the hip-hop emerging from the South Bronx with its rhythmic sophistication and melodic pleasure. New York City may have been segmented generally along neighborhood borders, dividing it along lines of race, ethnicity, class, and more. But New Yorkers had a psychology informed by living in a city dense with humanity, awake at all times of the day and night, everyone and everyone else's face, an unspoken sense that all of us were in the same wild boat. The two movements, punk and disco, not only coexisted, but crossed paths. They could no more be kept apart than the passengers of a subway car at rush hour.
So beautiful, and so stimulates so many memories, because I was also in New York during the blackout of 77. And I might have myself, that really beautiful, Thurston, such a beautiful description. I might have been living in a building that had no electricity at the time. So did it matter to me? No, except I had to hitchhike from the upper 70s down to below to Warren Street, living next to Jody Harris.
Thurston, was a drive home. You said you made it back to Connecticut. Was the drive home terrifying? Yeah. I mean, yeah. I can only imagine.
There's a few more pages of that, but that got edited out.
Okay, if you don't mind, Tim, I'm finishing my story.
Sure.
Let's not also forget that was the summer of Sam. That would be Son of Sam. That was also, the blackout of 77 is what kind of jump-started hip-hop, because a lot of people rightfully broke into electronic shops on Broadway, looted them, and got their equipment to start making hip-hop and early rap music. It was a really bizarre, intense experience. Also, I was very happy that you mentioned the that pamphlet they put out. What was it called? City of Fear? What was the pamphlet Thurston talking about? Which
Fear City.
Fear City, which warned people about what New York was then. It was a really fabulous year.
Yeah, I mean, it was an incredible summer, because it was a heat wave summer. And so the fact that the city city was brought to its knees by the blackout. I mean, it was millions upon millions of damage and theft. And by the time lights came back, it took about a good solid week before
Horrifying.
to get the city back together. And it was just it was the cover of Time magazine. It was just like, what the hell is happening right now?
Well, also about that period of time in New York, what people need to realize, and in retrospect, it's much easier to see, is that there was in the Bronx and on the Lower East Side a purposeful burnout of buildings to get rid of the punks, the artists, the queers, the people paying rent controlled tenants, and
collect insurance.
Bankers and bankers and real estate agents have a 30-year time. We have to think about 30 days paying our rent. They thought about 30 years, and hence why the Lower East Side now, I mean, when I was paying $150, you know what I'm talking about, for an apartment, you can't rent a porta potty on the corner of the street for that now.
Arson was a very successful tactic, for real estate slumlords. I mean,
And I advise anybody to read Mike Davis's book, Dead Cities, which I think might address this. I'm not sure, but anyway, it's a great book. And that was just part of the beauty and the horror of New York City. You look, you're not now as shy as you once were, but you were really shy. But you still managed to get to New York, live on 13th Street below Avenue A, 1 block from me, by the way. And because your passion was greater than your fear.
That's true. And also, I mean, I was maybe more wary than shy. I mean, I was definitely sort of kind of I was a little. I mean, it seemed like a lot of people, you included, that I would sort of eyeball in these places. I felt like you guys were you knew each other, and there was a liberation and freedom in that kind of power of numbers. And so seeing you and James and Pat Place, and just like it seemed like you were a gang. I had one friend, and he was a young gay kid from Connecticut, and I tell that story in this book. But I was always looking with envy at you guys, because you guys were obviously my age, and we were young. We were like 18, 19, whereas the bands on stage for the most part were Ramones and Patty age, and Debbie Harry or whatever, a little older, like in their mid-20s, which was ancient, And then when you guys
17, it's kind of old.
Yeah, so when you guys
Bob Klein, kind of old, but the best out there, of course.
But with all due respect, I mean, we loved them, and they were kind of our older brothers, and they were mentors to us. But when you guys started hitting the stage, it was like, in some ways, it just kind of like, it was that much more shocking and interesting than what was happening with the Blondies and the
Well, look, Thurston, I always felt outside of even the outside, even though I've been inside of many different scenes in many different cities. I always somehow still felt my natural superiority complex. I'm not sure. I'm like, I'm still outside of everything, but maybe, which is why I'm so welcoming to other outsiders.
Well, it's interesting, Lydia. It's interesting because, as Thurston just read in that passage, the divisions and the tribalism within, consumed popular music, if you will. So punk and disco, and then of course coming together. Would you say, a victim, or were you susceptible to that tribalism? I mean, I know your record collection is pretty vast and eclectic. Did you always have vast and eclectic tastes growing up, and you just kind of lean towards things you like to, or?
I think most people who were actually really interested in what was going on with like what happening around the punk rock scene downtown, and we never really sort of like called it punk rock or whatever like that, but that's what it was being genreized.
Oh, I called it anti-punk rock myself. Yeah. Thank you very much. Carry on.
It was just like, it was okay because it really meant that you were kind of you were making music that the rest of the world considered wrong. And so in that sense, that sort of embracement of wrongness was like was something that really kept us together as a community. We just felt so glorious in our wrongness. And I still do, actually. I mean, it's just like, to me, it's like, I like the wrongness of the expression.
Well, I want to ask you this, Thurston, because look, as two people that are very wrong according to the status quo of most things, and me especially, probably politically incorrect forever, is that Was it weird to you when, as someone who is a natural born outsider on many fronts, and also just because, for instance, we like to read books, but more people read books back in those days as well. That you and when I always try to tell people, the Sonic Youth, they have more influence than what they had financial success, because everybody knew them as part of what was becoming was being pushed at the time. But you worked fucking hard. You toured a lot. You toured probably more then than it's even possible to tour now. And people don't realize how hard that touring was. It was brutal. It was gruesome. It was not very rewarding, but you kept doing it. And through the insistence and your own resistance against what norm was, is why that, and again, we are still here. We're not going away. We just kept doing what we knew we were born to do. And so what, I guess the question is this: you became more notorious really than financially popular, because let's face it, you're not Lana Del Rey or Nirvana, sadly. But how did that start to feel to you as somebody who is a weirdo, and suddenly Sonic Youth is getting really big? Was that weird to you?
We, after, by the end of the 80s into the 90s, we certainly, our profiles certainly became, bigger. But a lot of it had to do with bands forming in the late 80s and 90s that were looking at that were inspired by what had happened with bands like us. And we were, the fact that we sort of stayed together into the 90s, I think a lot of the bands in the 80s had already sort of fractured by the time of the 90s come around. But we were still together, and we were sort of just, we always sort of had this feeling that we were, constantly an apprenticeship or something. I never felt like we, even to this day, even when we ended in whenever 2011, I never felt like we reached any kind of like ultimate goal, even though I think
excuse me, but I'm going to say this: some of the early Sonic Youth shows at CBGBs, and then many years, decades later, at a show that you did in Spain at Primavera Sound, where you did one of the earlier albums. These were some of the most hair-raising on the back of the neck performances I've ever seen, where the sound of guitar tornadoes, which was it just hasn't been, and it had to be live, because even whatever the records were, I felt, how can you even capture that on a record when it's such a live, hair-raising, transcendent, in that moment, going elsewhere, extra stellar thing? And really, those were some pretty fucking dynamic shows, early on and then later on. So whatever happened in between, I'm just saying, I was there for the bookends of this, and it was pretty fucking amazing. So thank you, my friend, for being you.
I'm wondering, because you guys kept on pushing into the 90s compared to other bands. Is it because how much do you think it's because you guys didn't have, I assume this, massive drug and alcohol problems?
Well, we did. That certainly is one thing. I always felt like, even when we were on like Lollapalooza in '95.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It was sort of like I don't, maybe I should pinpoint Lollapalooza 95.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah. Pinpoint it.
A lot of bands that we would sort of play with that were really into just getting completely and utterly inebriated, if not destroyed. And paradoxically, the music they were making was really sort of conventional. And I realized that, we kind of put our interest in sort of being, getting some kind of radical experience was like through the work, and I basically didn't want to, Lydia talks about reading books. It's like, I wanted to buy books, so I couldn't really buy books.
Well, the only, I think, excuse me, I'm going to just reveal it. It seems to me like the only thing you ever really dabbled with is a little bit of, toki here and there.
But I didn't even like that. I didn't even like that because it always made me feel disconnected. And I didn't really want anything to distract me from working out the musical ideas or the literary ideas. I just felt like maybe it would help. It seems to be helping some people. They seem to like it encourages their work, but in some ways,
what about acid though?
acid teenage years a little bit, but I felt completely like out, this lack of control. I always wanted like to be able to sort of be cogent, in my thinking. And so
Is that fear-based or just control-based or just, why do you want to?
it's probably control based. I think maybe well, it could be fear based in a way where I notice that when I get too inebriated, I start becoming self conscious and I feel like I freak myself out thinking about myself, and then I realize like, well, that's just that's your ego.
And most people, when they become inebriated, are not conscious of exactly how assholic they're becoming. So
you have the opposite effect that most people have. It sounds like actually.
Somebody told me I'm smoking the wrong end. Maybe they're.
Well,
But I find drugs. To me, drugs in music memoir literature is like the most boring thing. I mean, it's like I read so many music memoirs. I read a lot of music memoirs.
Well, except for Three Dog Nightmare, where it's just so pathetic. You can't help it almost puke in the toilet.
I Am Ozzy. I Am Ozzy is pretty good, but.
Well, I mean, I've enjoyed reading some of them, but it's like it's just so much of trying to score, how to score, when you score, and I was like
feeling terrible, waking up.
Yeah, and I don't find it that remarkable. I mean, it's like great. I mean, if you like your addiction that much, fantastic. But to me, it's just like writing about like I think I want to go eat an apple right now because I really like eating. I mean, I just don't care. Taking drugs is like that's you eating your food. I don't want to know about you eating your food. It's boring.
It's you eating your brain or trying to find a piece of it that you can't just consciously access.
Reading a Delbert Ties book, which I thought was fantastic, Twist. That book is like so much about her life is so defined by interaction, whether it's random or whether it's just like it's just, and mostly it is random. It's just like when you're a child where you get tossed, and it's like that, that's it's such a harrowing and beautiful read. I think I look forward to her follow-up when she talks about New York City.
Do you find yourself to be pretty social in general when you enter the world?
I really like just being with Eva, my wife here, and I don't really like going out that much and being in social situations. I can take it or leave it. I really like, to me, right, like I don't even want to tour anymore. I feel like I'm 65 and I'm sort of like I'm a little toasted on it, and it's a different world right now in regards to that. I really like.
But you're 65, like people are like 32.
But to me,
but still,
to be in some kind of state of being alone and writing, I really treasure it. I really treasure it. I have we have a few friends that we connect with, but very few. We live in.
I rarely leave my house if I'm not on tour. I just don't either. I like people coming to me. That's a selected few. But again, people don't realize with the writing, I mean, it's a very onanistic life. I mean, it could take a minute. It could take, 10 years to get to the point you need to make. And you kind of need this isolation, which is kind of a luxury and kind of delicious and kind of agonizing at the same time. It's a agonizing luxury. But I mean, you've always been involved in, ecstatic piece poetry. You've always been, and I remember a few poetry readings we did together. Yes, we did. More to come.
I talk a little bit about that in the book. I write a little bit about that. But I'm writing fiction right now, and I'm focusing on the protagonist of the book. It's total bliss. And I kind of, in some way, it's reactionary to sort of contemporary literature, which is like, it's really sort of focused on sort of the aspects of darkness in our contemporary lives, which I'm totally into. I think that's wonderful to read. But I kind of wanted to sort of flip the script a little bit and just write about the people in what I know in the milieu of downtown New York City, early 80s, but it's utter bliss, it's utter love. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to do, almost to the point where it's like, it's for children only,
Well, I think what's interesting, Thurston, about why we connected once overcoming your shyness, and because usually half the musicians I work with have been pretty shy. Roland Howard, Thurwell, yourself, various others. It's like you see in me something more aggressive men might not see because they're terrified of my aggressive nature, which once you get past that, you actually see my bliss, my joy, my humor, my sensitivity.
I knew that immediately. I knew that immediately when I first met you, and I
You
remember
once called me the nicest girl you've ever met, and that was nobody else would know what you mean by that.
I remember you coming back from travels once, and we met up in New York, and we were walking somewhere, and as we were walking on the street, I think we were coming from like Mike Giroux's rehearsal space way over there. We were walking somewhere, and you had just come back, and you said, "I've made a decision. I'm only going to share love with this world."
Well, I guess I meant your world. Your world.
No, but you were really serious about it. Like you thought, like that was like that to you was like that was the great energy that works. That was what made it more than just darkness.
If I didn't have so much fucking love for the individual and other people that suffer from things I don't even suffer from, but I recognize, I wouldn't continue to do what I do. And it takes mostly sensitive people to see that I am, even if the language appears negative, if the energy is so aggressive, that I'm doing this out of a base of love. And also because my hatred is so immense.
But that's focused. That's focused criticism.
Well, that was alchemical where hate becomes that and becomes this love. And to me, that's what I heard. For me, I felt like I was hearing an epiphany that you had, and we were still pretty young then, and I was like, oh, that's really. I thought that was what it was really a powerful thing for you to say, and you said
those that I love. I mean, endless, non-judgmental. Welcome to my world, because again, my hatred is never on a personal level. It's so gigantic to all the things we know are fucking hateful. How about another passage from the book before we wrap this up? The book is called Sonic Life by Thurston Moore, one of my favorite people on the planet, endlessly unjaded, like myself. We're not jaded, endlessly creative. And the word is always important, even if the song is instrumental.
Okay, I'll read you something. Let me see.
Thank you.
I'll read you a little something. A little something.
All right, you get your little something.
This is something we were talking about earlier, so I'll read this.
Thank you.
It was hard in those waning months of the 1970s to imagine that the city's fortunes might ever change. New York's near bankruptcy had been destroying its infrastructure since at least 1975, with 1/5 of public workers laid off, resulting in an extreme shortage of firefighters and police on the job. Fires in impoverished neighborhoods, whether by accident or by arson, were simply left to burn. A brochure with a hooded skull and the words, "Welcome to Fear City," would be handed out to tourists arriving at airports, issued by the New York City Police, with tips for survival, mainly staying away from the subways and avoiding the streets after 6 in the evening. Subway cars were ravaged tin cans, broiling hot in the summer, freezing in the winter, consistently malfunctioning. Fights and robberies weren't unusual. Graffiti seemingly covered every exposed inch of vertical surface, subways, buildings, street signs. Some of it was ornate and astounding, the rest a chaos of tags and unintelligible scrawl. Living on 13th Street between Avenues A and B, I was no stranger to dilapidation, though it was hardly as intense as only a few blocks farther east, toward the East River, where rows of buildings stood gutted, their windows so many black eyes, and that still had nothing on sections of the South Bronx. Lying in bed in the middle of the night that July, my 2 front windows open, secured by rickety metal grates, a cheap fan clacking as it pushed the humid air into something resembling a breeze. I would listen to the life below. Teens yelling at each other from either side of the street. Men sitting in their cars, honking their horns long and loud for reasons I could never fathom. No one would dare complain. To do so could be to invite a brick through your window. One particularly steamy night, someone decided to play a cassette of a Richard Pryor comedy album at stadium volume, huge speakers sitting atop their car hood. I awoke at 3 a.m, shocked by the loudness, wondering if there was an actual live concert happening in the middle of the street. I saw out my window all the families in the neighborhood sitting on stoops, children racing about, leaping off cars. Small fires and trash cans illuminated the spontaneous scene, people happily whooping it up as they listened to Pryor's routine on the insanity of America.
So poetic, so beautiful, so accurate about a time and place we lived in and survived and thrived beyond. That's from Sonic Life by Thurston Moore. This is the Lydia and Spin. Lydia Lunch, Tyndall, Thurston Moore. I love you so much, my
Beautiful
friend.
as usual. I look forward to our future meetings and yeah, don't be a stranger.
Are you going to INC this year?
No, I'm not. I don't know if I'm going to do INC International Noise Conference. I mean, I was invited. I got to tell you, I'm really not. I don't go out so much anymore.
That's what you're saying. Yeah,
I'm enjoying.
Fun to stay home and write.
I'm staying home and write.
Read, binge, whatever.
I actually was going to ask you about this because you know when someone talks to you, all these things are very fluid. But you were saying you were not basically documenting all these things, and you had to go back and do research on your own life, basically. Did it take just one seed and it would all blossom from there, or did you constantly have to just go and just get sources all the time?
I mean, I started right before the pandemic year of 2001, and I worked all through that year in isolation. And I spent all of 2022 editing it with the editor, who said, I asked you for a 300 something page book.
Maybe 800.
You gave me Ulysses times 2. And I was just like, well, I've never read Ulysses, but I'll take your word for it. I have seen the heft of that book.
Did you feel any kind of like relief is really not the word, but more like it's kind of like that is one of your true landmarks is this book. It's kind of, we know all the music, we know the trajectory of what happened throughout that. But I think both you and I, we feel that literature is very important to us still. And to get it down on paper, on the page,
exactly,
somehow salves something in our soul.
Well, there's a certain sense of like you're working with the art of writing, which we both, obviously, that's something that we feel we know. I mean, you've been writing since you were a little kid, and so you know what that is, and you know what that sense of sort of personal value is, that you can express yourself through the written word, and your take on vocabulary, which is music unto itself. So you have always dealt with alliteration in such a way that really kind of is very. It's really personal to you as a person. So when I read your writing, I see you. And that's really important, because that's not something that you experience much in a lot of books. A lot of books are just written on spec, and they have a story to tell, whatever.
Anyway, Thurston, thank you so much. I hope to see you. I will be in the UK soon. I will be there.
We return there April.
I'll be there after that. Thank you, my friend. This is the Lydia and Spin, Lydia Lunch, Tyndall, Thurston Moore, Sonic Live, out now, mandatory.